Today we're going to talk about the K219 disaster. Happened off the coast of Bermuda in 1986. One thing I want to load up front is this disaster could have been prevented and should have been prevented, and the mistakes that led to it are not unique to the Soviet Union. They were made by both the American Navy right now and the Soviet Union back then. It includes time, training, and tools. All those were taken away from the crew of the K219 and resulted in nuclear weapons and nearly a nuclear power disaster right off the American East Coast. There's a lot to be learned here. Enjoy. All right, welcome to the K219 disaster. This takes place in 1986. In the years leading up to this event, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had decided to increase the number of ballistic missile submarine patrols off the East Coast from 2 a year to 3 a year. And this caused a real strain on the supply system and the submarine culture as a whole for the Soviet Union, because they didn't have enough units to cover this 50% increase in patrol volume. They didn't get ready for it. They didn't prepare for it. They just top down ordered it and were expected to execute it. So this caused a lot of problems logistically for the Soviet Union, the Red Navy. Besides just logistics, they also had problems with maintenance schedules because that had screwed that up. Training schedules. These crews were on regular training periods, and that became a period of time in the Soviet Navy where the sailors just weren't trained, or they missed their trainings because they were deployed and they had to be rescheduled. And there they are being deployed with experience but no training. And in the case of the 219, they'll have almost half the crew on this patrol have no sea experience, have very little training experience, and 1/3 of the officers had just been rotated. So there's a lot of new people that have never been underway on this particular submarine before. A lot of them don't have any sea experience at all, and a lot of them are new to each other. So they don't know the ship, they don't know the crew. They're going underway for the first time with each other. So that is the recipe of disaster that has led to the events of the K219. So in September 1986, K219 goes to sea under those conditions, and she takes position about 30 days later on October 3rd off the coast of Bermuda. You can see her position right here in the lower right-hand corner. At 0450 local time on October 3rd, she's at periscope depth. She comes down from periscope depth after doing a routine communications check to 250 feet. Her starboard reactor is at 30%, and the port reactor is shut down. And this is normal for a Soviet ballistic missile submarine in its full quiet lineup on patrol. They've already reached their destination. They really don't have anywhere to go for the next 30 or 40 days. So they shut down one reactor completely and leave the second reactor at a very low power state, just enough to provide 4 or 5 knots of propulsion and electricity and support the auxiliary systems around the submarine. So this is a normal lineup for the Yankee class SSBN. At 0515, the morning watch is in the missile compartment, and they find a little bit of water leaking out of missile tube number 6. Right here, missile tube number 6 has a little bit of leaking coming out of a plug at the bottom of the tube. They call over the senior warrant officer who was on watch at the time, and they begin to pre-compress the plug, which in layman terms is squeeze the plug back in to stop the leaking. The problem is there shouldn't be any seawater at all in these tubes. These should be dry tubes with nuclear R-27 missiles in them. And whenever they try to reposition or pre-compress this plug, it results in a stream of water shooting out of the plug, and immediately the warrant officer calls a missile emergency, flooded tube, water in missile tube number 6. At 0530, just a few minutes later, a pump is started at the bottom of this missile tube to begin removing water from the tube, because they think at this point it could just be condensation. It's probably not flooding from the top or outside the boat. They think that there's just a little bit of water in the bottom. If they get the water out, everything will be fine. But as the water level goes below the plug, some brown clouds of gas begin coming out. This toxic gas is a result of seawater mixing with the liquid fuel oxidizer and has created a corrosive acid that begins spewing out of the missile tube and collects up here because it's lighter than air in the upper parts of the missile compartment. And this is a very corrosive gas that begins eating away rubber seals, anything that's plastic, it begins dissolving it. It's extremely corrosive. And within about 3 minutes of this initial casualty being reported and executed, an explosion occurs in missile tube number 6, rocking the submarine, blowing off part of the missile tube and the compartment in front of it. Damage goes up this direction into compartment number 3 and sends toxic gas into compartment number 3 up here. So now we have toxic gas in 2 compartments. It's highly corrosive. You can't breathe it and it's damaging equipment. And compartment 3 is the communications department. So they've lost their ability to send and receive radio transmissions within minutes of a casualty occurring. Captain immediately orders, come to periscope depth. After the explosion, he orders an emergency blow be placed on all main ballast tanks. And maneuvering back here, these guys back here controlling the reactors, say that there is a short to ground on both the port and starboard electrical buses, probably in compartment 4, but they haven't isolated it yet. And because submarines and all naval ships operate on what's called a floating bus, any kind of short to ground is very dangerous, more dangerous than a normal grounded system, because the short to ground will create a lot of heat, and that will eventually become a fire. So you have a corrosive gas that is also very explosive with some water in the missile compartment number 4 with no communications, damage in 2 of your 10 compartments, and you're losing your electrical bus with a potential fire hazard beginning, all within about 10 minutes of this casualty beginning. The time is now 05:50 in the morning. Everyone's awake. The captain says, let's put an atmospheric pressure on compartments 2 and compartments 5. And the way that they do that, boundary between compartment 2 and compartment 3 are right about here. So they're going to seal all the watertight doors as part of their immediate actions, which they did do. By the way, the crew probably saved the ship by their immediate actions. And they're going to make an atmospheric seal right here in compartment number 5. Compartment number 5 is the second half of the missile compartment right here. So what they're going to do is they're going to ventilate, bring in air into these compartments forward and aft to prevent the toxic gas and the smoke from moving forward and aft, from basically spreading throughout the submarine. It's an air barrier. Not only did they shut all the watertight doors and ventilation, they're increasing pressure in these other compartments to keep the smoke out of the other parts of the submarine. But as all this is happening, rubber seals are literally melting to goo due to the toxicity. The watchstanders that evacuated from missile compartment number 4 report that they estimate, after the explosion, approximately 4.5 tons, or a full bilge, full of seawater right down here. So they have a lot of water and a lot of oxidizer combining, making this very toxic gas that's melting everything. The XO decides that he's going to go to the bridge and take a look and just see what happened from a topside point of view, because everybody's in their compartments now and they can't see what's going on in compartment 4. The watchstanders coming out of compartment 4 are telling a terrible tale. They're like, there was an explosion, everything's damaged, they have no radio communication anymore, it's really bad. He gets topside on the bridge and sees what you see here on the left-hand side. You can see right here a big portion of the topside has been blown off. There's supposed to be a missile hatch right there, and there is not. And more importantly, from this angle, you should be able to see the nose of the R-27 missile, and you cannot. The warheads that were on top of the R-27 missile have been thrown into the ocean, as well as a large part of the missile, if not the entire missile. We don't know. All we know is that the top half of the missile, where the warheads is no longer with the submarine. That's what the XO sees whenever he goes to the bridge, and he goes right back down and tells the captain and says, we've got ourselves a nuclear accident, weapons emergency. It's a mess topside. So at this point, it is 6 o'clock in the morning. The captain orders the entire missile compartment, both compartments 4 and 5, evacuated. So now we have half the crew in the after half of the submarine and the other half in compartments 1 and 2. he orders the port reactor brought online. Up to this point, he's only had one reactor at about 30% providing power for the whole submarine. Because this is not a nuclear power problem, it makes sense to bring up a second power source so that if they lose the reactor that they have online now, they don't lose all electricity compounding the casualty. Bringing on both reactors at this point in the casualty makes sense. But as you can see, things are about to go very wrong. So it's going to be a couple hours before the port reactor is critical because they're bringing up per procedure, and that still takes a long time. The damage control team is ordered to enter compartment 4, assess the damage, and remove the bodies. They do that, and they do confirm that they have a large hole connecting compartment 4 and 3 now. The toxic gas is all over compartment 4. They use breathing apparatuses in there, but even as they walk through this toxic brown cloud, it's eating away at their skin. It burns. Also the seals for their breathing apparatuses, they can only spend a few minutes in compartment 4, but they do manage to remove the bodies of the 2 sailors that were killed in the explosion in there. And by the time they do that, it is 9 a.m. in the morning, and both reactors are now critical. At 9:30, the captain decides to pump the oxidant out of tube 6 overboard. So he believes that because the water is down here, there could still be some oxidizer in the tube causing toxic gas, because the toxic gas, according to the damage control people that went in there to remove the bodies, is still being generated. So he decides to use the pumps that are in compartment 4 to pump the bilge overboard. Well, as he does that, cloud vapor of the oxidizers begin to fill compartment 4 again. This actually exasperates the problem whenever he tries to pump the water out of the compartment. The water was acting as an insulator, keeping the fumes in the tube and keeping it from getting into the actual compartment. Once he removed the water, there was nothing keeping the fumes from boiling out of the damaged tube into compartment 4, making the toxicity of the compartment much worse. After about 5 minutes, they realize they're making the problem worse, not better. And the toxic gas that's also extremely flammable and corrosive going around compartment 4 reaches some electrical components somewhere in the compartment, starting a fire. So now we have toxic gas, smoke, damaged nuclear weapons, and a fire in compartment 4. The captain orders compartment 4 completely abandoned and let the fire burn itself out. This is the state the submarine sits in on the surface for the entirety of October 3rd, 1986. And it isn't until 1800, at the end of the day, the sun is starting to set, it's going to get dark soon, they decide, let's try and finish off the fire after letting it burn itself out all day, flooding compartment 4 with the Freon fire extinguishing agent. This has already been installed. This is what it's designed to do, is to flood a compartment with non-combustible gas like Freon and basically starve the fire of any oxygen. And because the Freon is heavier than air, it won't just go out the top of the submarine. It will fill the compartment, and then whenever it begins coming out the top of the submarine, you know the entire compartment does not have enough oxygen for fire combustion. So that's what they do at 1800. That goes for about 40 minutes. At 1840, compartment 4 and 5 door is open for inspection. They send another team in here from compartment 3 to compartment 4 to inspect the damage again. They continuously do this. And one of the problems with doing this is every time they open up one of these compartments to send in a damage control team, whether it's to assess damage, collect bodies, do whatever, fight the casualty, they're spreading this toxic gas, just a little bit of it, into other compartments. So whatever had gotten into compartment 3 is also getting into compartment 2 at this time. So they go into compartment 4 and they try to open up the door to compartment 5. Compartment 5, to everyone's surprise, is full of smoke. Right here, full of smoke. You can't see anything as you open up the door, which is at the top of the compartment. Full of black smoke. They immediately call away. The fire is actually in compartment 5, not in compartment 4. The captain orders the execution of Freon fire extinguishing agent into compartment 5, flooding compartment 5 with Freon. They let this Freon sit for approximately 30 minutes before at 7:30 at night, maneuvering calls in that they've lost all 50 hertz and on the starboard bus, and the starboard reactor has scrammed itself out of safety precautions. But the rods fail to properly set. These rods were probably damaged during the casualty due to high temperatures in the reactor compartment. The fire had burned, unbeknownst to the crew, in compartment 5 for hours. They did not know that compartment 5 was on fire, that everyone thought it was compartment 4 because that's where the casualty began. The fire had spread to compartment 5 and had caused high temperatures in the reactor compartment, which was right behind it, damaging the reactor rod control springs. So now they have a reactor that scrammed itself, but the reactor rods didn't seat properly. And now the only way to fix that is to go into the reactor compartment and manually screw down the rods by hand. This is a very dangerous evolution in a high radiation environment. It's not going to be good for whoever goes in there. Because of the toxic gas and the corrosivity of it all, at 8 o'clock at night, 2000, smoke begins to fill compartment 6. Compartment 5 fails to isolate the ventilation. There are no more seals on any of these ventilation isolation flaps. All personnel in compartments 6 are moved back after the reactor compartments to compartment 8. So what has happened here is the ventilation seals in this compartment have failed, and this place is now beginning to fill up with smoke too, and toxic gas. Toxic gas is accompanying the smoke during the entire time. I cannot stress how toxic this gas is. It is industrial grade acid that has been formed inside the tube whenever the oxidizer and the seawater combined with each other. And it's just eating through the seals of the submarine. So everybody who was in this compartment is pushed aft of the reactor compartments into compartments 8, 9, and 10 back here. A lot of the crew are back here now. A little bit of the crew are forward of the control room. At 8:30, 2 crew members enter the reactor compartment, compartment number 7, to manually lower the control rods into the reactor. They take 2 trips into a compartment that's well over 160 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the gentlemen, I believe it was a warrant officer, drops from heat exhaustion after the first trip. The second man, a young sailor, 20-something sailor, Seaman Brennan, goes into the reactor compartment a second time and manually screws down the last of the control rods, saving that reactor from going critical or overheating and melting in the future. He single-handedly saved this reactor from going out of control and melting through the bottom of the submarine. But while he was in there doing that on the second trip, the temperature had risen so much in the reactor compartment that it rose the air pressure beyond the point that they could open the door to compartment 8. Now, Soviet submarines have an emergency piece of gear in the reactor compartments to prevent this from happening because they thought of this beforehand. The only way in and out of the reactor compartment is one door. And anytime you have a compartment like that, you're going to have to take in things to account like air pressure difference. You literally can't open the door because of an air pressure difference. So in the bottom of the reactor compartment, there is a small vacuum pump that he can turn on, and he does, to begin lowering the pressure inside the reactor compartment and be able to open the door. Well, that pump, after a few minutes of operation, begins to smoke, filling the reactor compartment with smoke. So that pump fails and they're unable to open the door, and eventually Seaman Brennan does succumb to heat exhaustion and asphyxiation. He dies in the reactor compartment. All right, the time is now 9 p.m. at night. Compartments 8, 9, and 10 are ventilated topside. They open up the hatch. They can get out if they need to through this topside hatch. So those members of the crew that are back here in the engine room, this is the turbine rooms 1 and 2, and this is a hydraulics room back here at the very end. And they can climb through this hatch right here where my cursor's at and get topside. And they can ventilate 8, 9, and 10 compartments. By this time, some Soviet merchant vessels have responded to the distress call that they managed to get out. And it's 1 o'clock in the morning. They begin evacuating the crew off the top side of the submarine. The crew has been moved forward of the sail and aft by the rudder. They make operations to bring the crew onto a civilian ship that is pulled up alongside of them. At 01:45 in the morning of October 4th, the captain and 5 officers are all that remain on board the ship. They're in compartment number 2 there. They go over to the ship that's pulled up alongside them using their radio that works, requesting permission to scuttle and abandon the ship. And then they wait all day for a response. It isn't until 10 o'clock, October 4th, that the XO leads a damage control assessment party below to find what the status is of the submarine, because they've been sitting pitching on the water on the surface all day waiting for a response from Soviet Naval Command. They find that the battery is still partially charged, so that's good. They have some lighting down there. The hydraulics are completely exhausted. This is why you see these fairwater planes right here in the full rise position. That is to their mechanical stops pointing straight up. The reason why they're in that position is because the hydraulic fluid that controls them has lost all of its pressure, and gravity has pulled it down so that they fail in an upward motion. That's a safety consideration during the design of the submarine, that if it loses all hydraulics, at least the control surfaces are aiming towards the surface and not the sea floor. So he goes down there, he finds the battery is partially charged, hydraulics are completely gone, high pressure air is at half, so they still have some high pressure air. The topside deck is hot to the touch, so there's still a fire happening somewhere, probably in compartment 5 still, maybe even compartment 6 at this point. At 2300 hours, which is 11 p.m., October 4th, the captain orders the last main ballast tank blow using the rest of the high pressure air. All right, October 5th comes, and without any response from the Soviet Naval Command on whether they should scuttle the ship or not, nobody wants to make that call, it seems, back in Moscow. A second vessel arrives on scene. There will eventually be 3 Soviet merchant vessels on scene, but a second one arrives on scene and begins preparing to tow K219 back towards the Soviet Union. As she does this, the submarine draft slowly sinks overnight. So the water becomes higher and higher around the sail of the submarine, eventually covering the missile deck there as she's being towed north by northeast towards Russia. The next morning at 06:30, the tow line finally snaps because the tow is just too heavy, pulling the partially submerged submarine through the water. When the submarine is finally sunk up to its fairwater planes, the captain authorizes abandon ship and gets the 6 remaining people, including himself, off of the ship. K-19 founders for a couple hours after abandonment and then sinks below the waves, where she rests today, 680 miles east of Bermuda. So what were the causes that led to the disaster of the K-19 that nearly led to not only a nuclear weapons disaster, but a nuclear power disaster off the United States East Coast? First is the change in schedule without preparing the fleet for the change. We see this in today's American Navy. Back in the 70s and 80s, whenever they made this change to the ballistic missile fleet for the Soviet Union, they didn't provide the commands at sea with additional personnel, training, additional submarines. They said, hey, take what you're doing and do half of it more every year. They went from 2 patrols to 3 patrols in 1 year. That's just too much for them. So in the American Navy, what we see right now is some collisions happening in the Pacific Fleet. Part of that, this is not the sole reason, but part of that is a lack of training for the new watch standards, people not familiar with their gear, an exhaustion level of overstressed sailors being commanded to do too much. You know, the sailors in any Navy will do exactly what you tell them to the best of their ability to a fault. And what the leaderships need to understand is when they're telling their sailors to do too much, that things are going to begin breaking down, whether it's with the logistics supply system or if it's with training and command and execution at sea. Something, if not everything, will begin to fall apart. That's what happened with the K219. They had a new crew. Over half the crew was inexperienced. They had 1/3 of their officers had been replaced. A lot of the crew didn't know each other, and they also didn't know the particular submarine that they were operating in. If any one thing had gone wrong, it was probably going to cascade into something big. In this case, something rather large happened. A flooded missile tube with a liquid oxidizer that reacts violently to seawater, creating an explosion, cascaded into the loss of an entire ship, killing 4 crew members. Accidents like this can be prevented with proper planning, training, and time. Give your sailors the tools they need to execute the mission, and they will. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time. Hey, thanks for watching my YouTube video. If you want to check out more of my content, come on over to my Patreon page where I have multiple submarine briefs, very detailed videos that go in depth about a class of submarine, whether it's the Akula, the Typhoon, the November. There are about 17 of these briefs right now, including 7 audiobook style briefings, and of course pictures of Bianca over there on the Patreon page. And if you want some more free content, check out my articles on the Warzone. That's right, I'm writing for Warzone magazine now, and I contribute articles a few times a month over there. So definitely check out the Warzone magazine. Hit up Tyler Rogaway's articles, as he's a really good writer, and he has brought me on board his team as a contributor. And check that stuff out there. All the links are in the description and on the tags above. We'll see you over there. Bye.